Ava and Molly Roy, who live in a large Chinese metropolis, go about their daily lives without realizing that their mother Mrs. Roy has installed cameras throughout the house to constantly monitor them. Mrs. Roy is a highly demanding individual who cleans up after their kids even after they finish eating a snack and puts pressure on them to perform well in school for the benefit of the future. While her sister is still in the room, Molly is studying one evening when the pressure and stress finally get to her. She goes to the balcony to commit suicide. Losing her daughter is devastating for Mrs. Roy, who can't stop having nightmares about Molly's death and gets distracted by intrusive thoughts that sometimes keep her away from housework. However, she doesn't stop being strict towards Ava. In fact, now Ava is the only target of her mother's emotional outbursts. When Ava's mother receives her report card and sees that she has failed 3 classes, Mrs. Roy reprimands her and asks why she can't be more like Molly. She then forces her to sit on the floor until dinner is ready. The dean of Ava's school, Mr. Roy, is also growing weary of Mrs. Roy's attitude. He tries to be as supportive as he can, but Mrs. Roy only wants to talk about Molly and makes every meal miserable. Mrs. Roy feels guilty for not having seen the signs that made her daughter take such a decision, and Mr. Roy tries to remind her it's too late to play a guessing game now because Molly can't go back, but his words are ignored. Desperate for answers, Mrs. Roy starts searching her daughter's room and is shocked to find hidden papers that indicate Molly had been taking medicine for depression. Thinking back, she remembers Molly's last day, when she proudly told her she got the highest score in essay writing, but instead of congratulating her, Mrs. Roy scolded her. She reminded her that the subject that matters is math because Molly had to go to medical school, so instead of wasting time writing she had to practice more math problems, offering her own help since she has a master's degree from the States. Mrs. Roy also wanted Mr. Roy to be part of the conversation, but he kept staring at his phone. Mr. Roy felt he needed a break after working all day, but Mrs. Roy reprimanded him anyway, stating a housewife works non-stop but never requests a break because she had to maintain her face. Mrs. Roy remarked that she was the only one of the family with self-awareness after Ava and Mr. Roy left the table because they had had enough of her rants. Back in the present, Ava is enrolled in after-school tutoring, and Mrs. Roy approaches her at the end of the day to request that she also offer Ava the time that Molly had been taking. The tutor is unsure about this because double the slots would be too much for Ava, and when Mrs. Roy swears her daughter needs it, Ava cries out she doesn't want to and runs to her room. As soon as the tutor is gone, Mrs. Roy goes after Ava to yell at her, calling her useless and accusing her of wasting her parents' money. She reminds Ava she could have been a professor too if she hadn't become a mother, and Ava snaps back, telling her she never asked to be born. Offended, Mrs. Roy stomps out of the room, leaving Ava to have a breakdown on her own. Later, Mrs. Roy wonders if it had been a mistake to drop her career and depend on Molly for the future. She also tells her husband she went to school to pick up Molly's things and found a bunch of novels plus some letters for a boy called Sheng Yao thanking him for his support. She didn't know about any of these things, and Mrs. Roy feels like she didn't know her daughter. She also points out that Molly was very smart, and she couldn't understand how she could do something so incredibly stupid. Mrs. Roy questions whether she was being too reckless when Mr. Roy interrupts and says the opposite. She was being overly concerned. As everything she does is for the family's sake, Mrs. Roy becomes enraged at her husband's implied accusation that she is a control freak and launches into another tirade. Ava can hear the husband and wife's quarrel starting from her room, which keeps her up at night. Ava then starts to recall another awful night she experienced a few weeks prior. Molly had been up studying until late, and Ava could hear her sniffing, but Molly pretended it was allergies instead of crying. Molly also started wondering why she had to study so much since at first, she thought studying could get her what she wanted, but obviously it isn't the case after all. When Ava mentions Molly already has everything and everyone likes her, Molly drops the subject and accepts to go to bed while cuddling her sister for comfort. The next day at school, Ava is having the usual nap teens have in lunch break, but she's interrupted by a teacher that drags her to a study room. Molly used to come here on her breaks to study more, and Mrs. Roy has sent orders that she wants Ava to do the same. When Ava enters a locker in this area that still bears Molly's name, she discovers some startling documents that she decides to take with her. Mrs. Roy decides to pay Molly a visit after learning that she was seeing a psychologist covertly. Mrs. Roy calls Dr. Zhao a terrible doctor and storms out in a fury after she declines to discuss Molly's mental status due to patient confidentiality. Afterward, Mrs. Roy goes home to search for Molly's things again and suddenly remembers a lunch she had with another family a few months ago, where she told everyone about Molly's amazing achievements and how she would be a great doctor someday, which annoyed Molly a lot. Mrs. Roy's friend had a son named Zhishang, who told everyone about his latest research. He was working on a machine that would observe a person's daily routine, and based on that, it could accurately guess that person's thoughts and behavior. This would allow him to get actual memories that maybe not even that person wanted to face. Back to the present, Mrs. Roy goes to see Zhishang, who explains the machine is still in the trial phase because they have no human subjects to try it on, and nobody wants to volunteer because they would have to share many private things. Mrs. Roy wants him to use this machine on Molly to find out why she did something so drastic and hands him a USB stick with all the recordings from her security cameras. Now that Zhishang has all this data, he only needs a few days to build a model. Later, when Zhishang gets in touch with Mrs. Roy once again, he delivers terrible news: the data on the USB stick is insufficient. This merely depicts Molly's domestic life, which Mrs. Roy was already aware of. Other memories are required to completely comprehend Molly. Mrs. Roy, who is in need of answers, authorizes Jishong to access Molly's body and implant a chip in her brain to monitor her cerebral activity. The procedure goes smoothly, but the idea of reactivating Molly's neurons even if temporarily won't stop bothering Mrs. Roy, who keeps imagining Molly waking up and finding herself trapped inside the coffin. Later during dinner, Ava says she's going out instead of studying because a tutor can't magically make her smart like Molly. Mr. Roy worries about her, but Mrs. Roy tells her she can do whatever she wants and leaves the table after announcing she's tired of dealing with her. The next day, a stranger leaves an envelope for Mrs. Roy containing a mysterious news clip. When Jishong is finally done with the recreation of Molly's mind, he connects the machine to Mrs. Roy, who chooses to first visit Molly's last day. The poor girl had felt horrible over dinner when her mother wouldn't congratulate her on the essay achievement, and later while she was studying, she kept hearing her sister laughing at some comic she was reading behind her school book. Feeling alone and hopeless, Molly couldn't take it anymore and moved to end it all. When the memory is over, Mrs. Roy remembers the news clip someone left at her house, which was about a short story contest won by Sheng Yao, the guy in Molly's letters. Still in denial, Mrs. Roy thinks he may be responsible for Molly's death and asks Jishong to let her access older memories, not caring about the warning on how living through Molly's depression may affect her own mood. Sheng Yao took Molly to a book signing event where she met her favorite author and told her that she too writes. This is the memory she sees next. After the event, the author agreed to read Molly's short tale for the competition, but in the middle of it, Molly received messages from Mrs. Roy asking her to return home right away. In the end, Molly never showed her story to the writer or sent it to the contest, and she left the event in tears. This incident makes Mrs. Roy sure that Sheng Yao is to blame for Molly's deviance and decides to drop by the school to talk to him. Sheng Yao explains he likes boys, and he was never in a relationship with Molly. He had just been a friend who wanted to support her dreams. He doesn't have her novel because Molly was very protective of her work, and this makes Mrs. Roy think she wrote something shameful. Such a statement finally makes Sheng Yao snap, and he tells Mrs. Roy that he felt pity for Molly because lots of people knew she had a beautiful talent that her mother wouldn't let her pursue. Mrs. Roy refuses to believe lots of people knew about this side of her daughter and she didn't, so she assumes she must have been a bad writer and that's why she ended things. Later, Mrs. Roy acknowledges that Sheng Yao was accurate in that she didn't know Molly well. She wouldn't have known about all of this extra formation, though, if she hadn't been such a strict mother. When Ava returns home the following day with poor grades, Mrs. Roy is so enraged that she nearly beats her with a duster, but she stops herself just in time because she has a hallucination of Molly intervening. Sometime later, Mrs. Roy goes to see Dr. Zhao again, this time asking to become her patient. She explains she's been losing control of her emotions and she's had trouble sleeping, so she worries it may be depression. Drive. Zhao thinks it's too soon to tell since it may also be the grief that isn't being dealt with, prompting Mrs. Roy to confess she's been watching Molly's memories. One of these memories had been of Molly stealing a hairpin and bringing it home as a gift to her mother, who had scolded her for wasting money. Mrs. Roy has come to understand she didn't know her daughter at all, but she isn't sure if looking at the memories is making her feel better or worse. Dr. Zhao wonders why Mrs. Roy won't respect her daughter and if she saw all the memories of why she's still coming to her for help, by now she should already understand what happened and why Molly lied and hid things from her. Mrs. Roy doesn't get it and keeps asking for help, so Dr. Zhao gives her an exercise to deal with her denial. She must put herself in Molly's point of view and understand how Molly saw her own mother. As she explains this, Dr. Zhao remembers one of her own meetings with Molly, where she admitted she felt like a deviant because stealing and watching her mother wear the stolen goods made her feel guilty yet good. It started in 6th grade when she only took some money from Mrs. Roy and got hit for it, and since then stealing became very appealing to her. She didn't know if she wanted to look for pain or avoid pain, and every time she didn't do well on her exams, she added a mark. Dr. Zhao thinks Molly did that to take punishment, prompting Molly to confess she kept dreaming about Mrs. Roy finding the scars one day and apologizing for everything. Because Molly was disclosing her emotional wounds by including all of these things in her stories, she was made to feel even worse. Molly had been advised by Dr. Zhao to trust her abilities and to share the book with her family to see what would happen, but she never had the guts to do either. The papers that Ava discovered in the study area are later revealed to be Molly's story, which caused her to cry uncontrollably while reading it. Keeping Dr. Zhao's exercise in mind, Mrs. Roy goes to see Jishong again and asks to see herself from Molly's point of view. Finally, Mrs. Roy gets to experience what an authoritarian mother she had been. Even when Molly had been a small child and was saying silly things like wanting to be a cashier someday, Mrs. Roy would correct her to say accountant. Whenever she talked to her friends, Mrs. Roy would say having children was an investment. When Molly was in 1st grade learning the basics she was already pushed into studying more. Mrs. Roy would act cold towards any gifts Molly made for her, and whenever Molly came home with good grades, instead of congratulating her, Mrs. Roy told her it was thanks to her mother keeping an eye on her studies and not to be too pleased with herself or she'd lose rank. Whenever Molly made a mistake, Mrs. Roy yelled at her. Whenever Molly asked for even a little cash, Mrs. Roy would scold her for wasting money and demand gratitude. All of Molly's memories of her mother were like that. Mrs. Roy yelling at her, pressuring her, deciding her future, calling her interests a waste of time, calling her an embarrassment, and threatening with hitting her if she didn't study. Mrs. Roy takes the gadget out of her skull after being overcome by the realization that she has been responsible for Molly's death. She visits a police officer and requests to be detained, However, the police are unable to handle this situation, so they contact Mr. Roy and ask him to pick up his wife. The next day, Ava gives Molly's story to her mother, and Mrs. Roy gets to read the letter she wrote for the judges, saying her hard life didn't train her to write, yet it's also what inspired her to do so. Putting her painful memories on paper was Molly's hope to inspire and help others like her, but she also hoped her family didn't read this, especially her mom. This is why Sheng Yao entered her story in the contest under his name and won. Mrs. Roy enters Zhishang's lab without his knowledge after sobbing for hours and turns on the machine to relive Molly's final day. Her brain finally snaps under all the pressure of Molly's depression, making her remember Molly's birth at the same time she experiences Molly's last day under full pain. When Mrs. Roy opens her eyes again, she hallucinates Molly being there with her again, and she hugs the air as if that could truly comfort her.